Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream. Today, Ken Olson joins us, and we're going to be talking about Markan priority without Q, or the Farrer hypothesis. For those that don't know, yes, it is named after that book. I have it too.
All right.
Um, the the Farrer hypothesis, for those that don't know, is a position that Luke used Matthew and Mark, and that Matthew also used Mark, without the need for the Q document. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, Ken, take the mic.
Okay, so the secret of the Farrer hypothesis, what is it? Why does it have an advantage over the Q hypothesis? Is when you hear people talking about Q, they'll say, well, supposing that that there is no common source, that there isn't Matthew and Luke just got the stuff from Matthew. Well, okay, where did Matthew get his extra material that he has that didn't come from Mark? And the Farrer hypothesis, basically, well, I should say the Farrer-Goulder hypothesis, it was originally proposed by Austin Farrer, but then was developed by Michael Goulder. And Goulder thinks there's actually very little non-Markan material. Much of the material that is called the non-Markan material is actually taken from Mark. And that's what I want to talk about today. Okay, so first point, just recently on the show, I've seen you've had Rob McEwen talking about Matthean posteriority, which is similar to the Farrer hypothesis in that it accepts Markan priority. Mark was the first gospel, but then it says Luke used Matthew instead of Matthew used Q. And you've had Brad McLean on Lucan priority. But what I was really interested in is Brad McLean. I didn't watch the whole thing. For all of the stuff about the destruction of the temple and the prophecies, Brad McLean's position seemed to be, well, Jesus was a genuine prophet, and he genuinely knew ahead of time all the things that were going to happen. So all the prophecies were genuine prophecies. And then you've had also Jonathan Bernier, who's recently written a book, Redating the New Testament, that says that all of the documents in the New Testament were written before the destruction of the temple in 70. And the interesting thing about him is he's going to make this argument without presuming that Jesus was a genuine prophet that could foretell the future. He thinks that all of the references to the destruction of the temple don't require that we see them as post-event prophecies. He thinks these are things that somebody could reasonably have predicted, right? Somebody writing before 70 could reasonably have predicted that the temple would be destroyed. And in Mark's gospel, I think we have something like 4 explicit places that talk about the destruction of the temple. And then maybe it's implicit in a few more. And these would be in Mark 11, which I'll try to talk about today, the little apocalypse, or the apocalypse in Mark 13, 1-2. That's do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, as Jesus is in the temple. Okay, and that's the explicit one that people point to generally. But then in 1458, in Jesus' trial, people accuse him of saying he would destroy this temple built with hands and raise another not built with hands. But then the very next verse, it says this was false testimony against Jesus, implying he didn't really say that. And finally, as Jesus is being mocked on the cross, 15:25-32, people mock him as, you who would destroy the temple, right? So there are people mocking Jesus as, you think you could destroy the temple? But this is an awful lot, right? So Mark from chapter 11 on, chapters 11 through 15, he's talking about the destruction of the temple a whole lot. And one of the problems I have with Jonathan Bernier's hypothesis is he thinks, well, it's perfectly reasonable that somebody would have predicted the temple would be destroyed before 70, but we don't have that in the sources. Well, we don't have in the sources someone predicting the destruction of the temple in between the time of the Maccabees and the time of the Roman destruction of the temple in 70 CE. We just don't have that. And Jonathan Bernier says, well, we do, we have it in Josephus. Okay, we have Jesus ben Ananias is predicting the destruction of the temple. Josephus tells us that before the destruction of the temple, Jesus ben Ananias in Book 6 of the Jewish Wars predicted that the temple would be destroyed. So could you put up slide 1? Now, okay, Jacob, to bring you into the conversation, Josephus is writing Book 6 of the Jewish War when?
In the mid-70s.
Mid-70s, okay. So is the stuff he's written, was it really written before the destruction of the temple?
No.
No, it isn't. Okay. So we have this story that he writes down about Jesus, son of Ananias, who predicted the destruction of the temple. But Josephus already knows at the time he's writing the temple has been destroyed, and he produces this story. So Jonathan Berninger thinks, yeah, but that's no reason to reject the story, right? And I think this is a little bit of special pleading. We have lots and lots of post-event prophecies of the destruction of the temple. This happens a great deal. The famous one is in the Sibylline Oracles, that those predict the destruction of the temple. But of course, everybody accepts that as a prophecy. Everybody today accepts that's a prophecy after the fact. I think William Whiston in 1715 actually defended the Sibylline Oracles as being authentic, pre-70 oracles. But everybody today accepts, no, those are not. Those are written after the fact. Okay. So when we look at Jesus, son of Ananias, and this is a different person from Jesus Christ and what Josephus says about him, all right, he was a prophet who went around, he was a prophet of doom. So first we have him saying, a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the sanctuary. So specifically the temple, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against all the people. So this is a prophet. He wandered around Jerusalem and he said dire things, and he gets taken in front of the Roman governor. So this is before the rebellion broke out. The governor of Rome, the Roman governor is still there, and has him punished. And they decided, well, he's a madman, but he doesn't seem to be engaged in rebellion against Rome or anything. So they released him after having him scourged. So he returns to wandering around Jerusalem, and I've highlighted, so he says, woe to Jerusalem, and later, woe to Jerusalem. And finally, during the Roman siege, he's been saying that he's been wandering around Jerusalem saying, woe to Jerusalem for 7 years. And finally, the very last time during the siege, he says, Josephus writes, while going his round and shouting in piercing tones from the wall, woe once more to the city and to the people and to the temple. Okay, once more, as though he knows this is going to be the last time that I make this prophecy, right? He's not going to be doing it again. All right. And he says, and to the temple, and he added a last word, and woe to me also. So this isn't just the general woe to Jerusalem thing. He says, woe to me also. Once more, woe to the temple, and this time, woe to me also. And as he added this last word, and a stone hurled from a ballista struck and killed him on the spot. Immediately, when he had said, woe to me also, he's struck by a Roman ballista bolt and killed on the spot. And so with these ominous words still upon his lips, he's just said that he dies. Now, is Josephus recording a genuine prophecy that actually happened here, or has this been worked up after the fact? I think we have to say at least that final part with him saying, woe to me also, and being immediately struck and killed by a ballista bolt. Josephus or Josephus source, we don't really know which, is actually, working this up after the fact. It would be nice if we had an example from before 70 of someone predicting the destruction of the second temple, the Herodian temple. But we don't have that, and I don't think this passage about Jesus, son of Ananias from Josephus qualifies as a prophecy before the fact, because Josephus is writing the fact, and it shows signs of having been at least altered or touched up after 70, after the events, with Jesus, son of Ananias predicting his own death at the end there. Okay. Can you go to the next slide? I think this is going to be last. Go to the next. Okay. So the Farrer theory that a lot of the stuff in Matthew that isn't from Mark is actually sort of explanatory or expanding on Mark. Michael Goulder wrote a book in the 1970s called Midrash and Lection in Matthew. And he used the word Midrash to refer to this a Jewish method of interpreting scripture. And he got a lot of flack for using the term Midrash because it has a very technical meaning in rabbinic Judaism. And he wasn't really using it in that strict sense. But he was talking about what's now usually referred to as the rewritten Bible, where somebody takes a biblical passage and expands it. And I want to give this example from 2 Kings and Chronicles about the death of Josiah. So what happens with Josiah? He's one of the few good kings of Judah in the Old Testament. Okay, that basically after David, there's Hezekiah and there's Josiah, and all the rest of them are pretty rotten. So Josiah finds a book, while the temple is being refurbished, and he realizes, oh, we've been celebrating Passover wrong. So he suppresses all of the worship in the high places. Apparently, according to this text, Jews were worshiping Baal in the high places, and he suppressed that and had Passover celebrated in Jerusalem, right, just the way God wanted it, and directed to them in this lost book that had turned up. So Josiah comes off very well in the book of Kings, all right? But then it narrates his death, Pharaoh Necho was going to attack the king of Assyria, and Josiah goes to meet him in battle, and when Necho met him at Megiddo, he killed him. All right. Kings doesn't provide an explanation. It's just something that happened. Well, Josiah had these reforms. He celebrated Passover properly, just the way the book they discovered in the temple told him. But then he goes to fight Pharaoh Necho and he dies. All right. So we find the same story in the book of Chronicles about the death of Josiah. But the chronicler has a lot more to say about it. He says, Necho sent envoys to him, meaning Josiah, saying, what have I to do with you, king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house to which I am at war. God has commanded me to hurry, cease opposing God who is with me, so that he will not destroy you. All right. So Necho warns Josiah, God wants me to do this. Don't get in my way, because if you do, God will destroy you. But Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God. Okay. So what do we have here? We have a theological explanation of why Josiah lost the battle and was killed. He didn't listen when Necho told him that God doesn't want him to oppose him, right? He disobeyed God, and that's why he was killed. Because for the chronicler, this is a theological belief he holds. Josiah had been a good king. The stuff he did that the book of Kings describes was entirely righteous. It was what God wanted. So why did he lose his battle and get killed? Well, he must have done something wrong. And so the chronicler adds this passage about opposing the will of God by fighting Necho when he had been warned that this was not according to God's will. All right, and so this is the kind of thing that Goulder thinks is going on with Matthew's use of Mark. Matthew is expanding Mark according to his theological beliefs about, these are things Mark should have said, or perhaps things he should have said but didn't. Okay, he doesn't need another source for this. He's just using his own theological knowledge and his knowledge of the Old Testament to expand on what's in Mark. Okay, can we get the next slide, please? All right, this is a bit small. So the first thing, this is, I'm sorry, could you go to the next slide? This is the Matthean version. I want the Markan version. Not that one. Stop. Go back to that other one. All right. So before we do Mark 11, I want to talk about the destruction of the temple in Judaism. Now, this is a passage from The Fathers, according to Rabbi Natan. The main character in it is Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, who is supposed to have lived at 70, right? He's credited as being the founder of sort of rabbinic Judaism and Yavna after the destruction of the temple in 70. He lived through the destruction in Vespasian. He asked Vespasian for Yavna and its sages. And so rabbinic Judaism is the surviving sages in Yavna, and Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai leading them. And in this case, this is about the destruction of the temple, right? This is a traumatic thing for Jews. And in this case, Rabbi Joshua says, right, he beheld the temple in ruins. He says, and Rabbi Joshua says, woe to us that the place where the iniquities of Israel were atoned for, is laid waste. Okay, what was the temple for? Well, you held sacrifices there because of your sins, and this, right, these were sin offerings, and the people, as long as it wasn't, egregious sins, deliberate sins, as long as it was accidental or sort of mundane sins, they could be atoned for by sacrifice. This was commanded in the Old Testament. You would sacrifice animals at the temple to sort of cleanse, to cleanse the people. All right. And Rabbi Joshua was saying, this is terrible. The place where the iniquities of Israel were atoned for is laid waste. And Rabbi Yohanan says, my son, be not grieved, for we have another atonement as effective as this. We have a system of atonement that's as effective as sacrificing animals. And what is this? It is acts of loving kindness. As it is said, for I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Hosea, and that's a quotation of Hosea 6:6. Jumping down in the next bolded part, it says, what about Daniel and Babylon? There was no temple, right? This was the destruction of the first temple. Daniel was living in the exile. There was no temple. And yet Daniel managed to replace the sort of sacrificial system through acts of loving kindness, that sins could be atoned for in that way. And this is something that in rabbinic Judaism, they're looking at, well, the temple's been destroyed. How do we deal with sin? Well, acts of loving kindness can in fact atone for sin. We don't actually absolutely need the temple, and we don't need the animal sacrifices. Okay, can we go to Mark 11 now? That's Lord's Prayer, back one. Back again. That's Matthew. Skip forward till we get, no, keep going, Mark 11. Yes. Okay. Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This is Mark 11. Now, long chapter, there's a lot in it. So the first thing, Jesus goes into Jerusalem, and there's sort of a parade spontaneously forms about him. But I'm going to skip to Jesus cursing the fig tree. All right. Jesus, in verse 11, Jesus looks in the temple, but then he leaves again. And then to the next day, he comes back to the temple. All right, so verse 12, we have the cursing of the fig tree. As Jesus is headed back to the temple, and he is, what? He stops, and he sees, hey, there's a fig tree there. And he goes to see if there's any fruit on it, and the fig tree has not borne fruit. And he curses the fig tree. He says, may no one ever eat from you again. And his disciples heard it. Then he goes into the temple, and we have the passage called the cleansing of the temple. Now, since the work of E.P. Sanders in about the 80s, scholars are reluctant to call this the cleansing of the temple. Now, one of Sanders' objections was Jesus isn't cleansing the temple. It's not like he expects it to be reusable again. There are still scholars that think Jesus was cleansing the temple. Sanders said, no, he's not cleansing it in the sense that I'll get rid of the stuff I don't like and then we can use it. He's making a prophetic demonstration that the temple will be destroyed. All right, so he, famous scene, like he drives out the people that are the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And this scene is in all four gospels in slightly different forms. Jesus drives out the money changers and those who sold doves, and he says, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. Now, a common interpretation among Protestants, and this is what E.P. Sanders was objecting to, is that Jesus didn't like the money changers and the animals being sold there. He thought this profaned the temple. And Sanders' point was, no, that's what temples were built for. In the ancient world, you sacrificed animals there, right? The whole point of building a temple was that's where the animals were sacrificed, and God had commanded that the animals be sacrificed. The reason Jews sacrificed animals was that God had commanded them to do this in the Old Testament. So that is not the thing Jesus was upset about. You have to have animals there, and you have to have money changers because people can go and just buy an animal there. It's much easier, especially for poor people, if you can just go to the temple and buy a dove there rather than bringing your animals from home, right? You could bring your cattle from home, or you could just buy one in the temple, and that's easier. So Sanders thinks that is not what Jesus could have been objecting to. All right. So what he says is, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. And this is from Isaiah. And he says, but you have made it a den of robbers. Now, Sanders makes the argument that Jesus was making a prophetic demonstration, but here I'm going to jump ahead to the work of Richard Hayes in Reading Backwards. Why does it say my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? Well, that's from Isaiah. There's going to be in the future, Gentiles and not just Jews will worship in the temple. Okay, it won't just be a Jewish thing. And this is what Jesus is saying, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. So there's something wrong here, okay? God's house is going to be a house for all nations, but this particular house, the temple, you have made it a den of robbers. It doesn't say God created the temple badly. It's you, meaning presumably the Jews, or at least the Jewish leadership, the priests and so forth, have made it a den of robbers. Now, did I give you a slide of Jeremiah, Jacob?
I don't think so. Could you send me the picture real quick? I can quickly get it in here.
Well, I can probably just read that one if we don't have it. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So what happens in Jeremiah is we have this verse that has, you have made it a den of robbers. And what Jeremiah is complaining about is that you've sort of made the temple into a sanctuary that you can just sin all you want, and the temple makes you safe. Okay, here we go. Jeremiah 7:8. Here you are, entrusting in deceptive words that no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods you have not known? And then come and stand before me in this house, meaning the temple, which is called by my name, and say, we are safe, only to go on doing all these abominations. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? So this is Jeremiah's criticism, or Jeremiah is voicing God's criticism of the way Israel is using the temple. Well, you commit all these sins, and then you do these sacrifices, then you just go out and sin again, and that's not the way this is supposed to work, right? This is abuse of the temple. So then God warns them immediately after the den of robbers, go now to my place that was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel. Okay, so he's referring to Shiloh, where the temple in the northern kingdom of Israel was, and he destroyed that. This is the destruction in 722. He's saying, look, the people of Israel had a temple in Shiloh, and I destroyed that because of the wickedness of the people. So after that, he goes on, and Jeremiah speaking for God. And now, because you have done all these things, says the Lord, and when I spoke to you persistently, you did not listen, and when I called, you did not answer. Therefore, I will do to the house that is called by my name, in which you trust, and to the place I gave to you and your ancestors, just what I did to Shiloh. And I will cast you out of my sight, just as I cast out all your kinsfolk. Okay, so this is Jeremiah speaking before the destruction of the first temple in 586, 587, and saying God is going to destroy the temple in Jerusalem just the way he destroyed the temple in Shiloh. All right, and Jesus quoting this verse is making a threat. There's going to be a house for all nations, but it's not going to be here. This house is going to be destroyed. Okay, and that house that will be a house for all nations is going to be the Christian church, which admits Gentiles. But this house in Jerusalem, the house of God, that one's going to be destroyed. And as he's leaving, we have the lesson from the withered fig tree. Okay, so before Jesus goes and threatens to destroy the temple, he curses a fig tree. And as he's leaving, they come upon the fig tree, and in the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its root. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you cursed has withered. Okay, now this has often puzzled people because, why is Jesus, destroying vegetation? That seems pointless. Well, this is also from Jeremiah, where he refers to, the nation of Israel as the fig tree that didn't bear fruit. I'm sorry, I don't have the reference in front of me, but this is another passage from Jeremiah. And the structure here is something Mark deliberately set up. This is what's called a Markan intercalation, where Mark starts a story and then he puts another story in the middle of it, and then he concludes the first story. So the first story frames the more important story that's in the middle. We have the cursing of the fig tree on both sides of the cleansing of the temple. And the cursing of the fig tree sort of represents or interprets the temple, right? That the temple hasn't borne fruit because, the temple cult has been misused by either the Jews in general or just the priesthood. Scholars, argue about that, just who's being condemned here. But we have we have the threat of the destruction of the temple, and we have the cursing of the fig tree on either side of it. And the fig tree is symbolic of Judaism or the temple. All right. But the interesting thing that I want to get to here is in verse, when Peter says, Rabbi, look, the fig tree you have cursed has withered it. Jesus answered, have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart and do not believe, what you say will come to pass. If you believe what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. Okay. Rabbi, this fig tree has withered. And Jesus says, believe in your heart and it will come to pass. That seems to be a non sequitur. What is the issue Jesus is actually addressing? Well, it's the exact same issue that Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai was addressing when Rabbi Joshua asked him about the temple being destroyed. Jesus has just foretold the destruction of the temple. And now Jesus says in verse 25, whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. Jesus is answering the same question about how will sin be atoned for after the destruction of the temple, after 70, when there isn't a temple anymore. How will it be done? And his answer is, you don't need a temple. Whenever you stand praying, wherever you might happen to be, you don't need to have a specific temple. Forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you. He's saying there is no necessity for a temple. Your Father will forgive you if you forgive everyone else. Okay. Jacob, any comments before we move into the next slide?
No, I'm ready to get to the next one.
Okay. So
which one's the next one?
There's one with 4 columns on it. Okay. This is the Lord's Prayer. And, well, Jacob, let's talk about this. Do you know the Lord's Prayer?
I haven't read it in a while.
Okay. So the common form that most people know who have read this kind of stuff, or who, went to church and all that. The common form that's used in churches today is the Matthean form, which is much longer than the Lucan form. Okay. The Lucan form is only about half as long as Matthew's form. And the Matthean form is, Our Father in heaven, may your name be hallowed, may your kingdom come. This isn't the usual language. The usual language is, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Okay, I'm using a slightly different translation than what's commonly used in English-speaking churches. Okay. Our Father in heaven, may your name be hallowed, may your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we ourselves have forgiven our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil, or the evil one. In Greek, you can't really tell evil abstract from the evil one, the person. It's the same word. All right, Jacob, so you've been hosting people on the synoptic problem. What do you know about the Lord's Prayer and Mark, and the Gospel according to Mark?
Well, I think, if I remember correctly, I think there's an argument that there was some unique material in Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer that's not in Mark.
Right. So this is part of the stuff that's supposed to come from Q. Is one of the things that's supposed to come from Q is the Lord's Prayer, because Mark doesn't have it. Okay, so Matthew and Luke must have had this other source, Q, because that's where the Lord's Prayer comes from.
Yeah.
All right, and Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer is shorter, and that's usually taken as an argument that, well, Luke's must be more original. Matthew is making it more poetic and adding to it. Like, Luke's shorter version is more original. Now, I think that's wrong. So looking at the second column, which is Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer, and the third column, which is Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer. And by the way, I have the paper in which I argue this is in this book again.
Right.
All right. Now I'm actually sort of supporting an argument Michael Goulder made in the 60s, right? This isn't original to me. I've added new arguments, but this is something that Michael Goulder argued. He thinks, and I agree with him, Matthew probably composed the Lord's Prayer based on items about prayer that are in Mark's Gospel. Mark doesn't have the Lord's Prayer, but he does say various things about prayer. And if you put them all together, you get about half the content of the Lord's Prayer. All right. So first I'm going to go over Luke. Matthew and Luke. The usual argument is, well, if he had seen the Matthean version, which is better, he wouldn't have cut out stuff, right? Matthew has this beautiful rhythm to it, and Luke wouldn't have cut it out. And I think this is wrong. In fact, if we look at the things Luke cuts out, it is additions that just repeat something he's already had. He stripped the Lord's Prayer down so that every new element in it he keeps, but every time it repeats something, he gets rid of the repetition. Okay, and this, I think, is a habit of Luke. He doesn't do it all the time, but he does this pretty often. All right, so first, Matthew has Our Father who is in heaven. Luke keeps the Father and gets rid of, the one in heaven. And the reason he does that, he's introduced in Luke 10:21, a chapter earlier than he gets to the Lord's Prayer. He says, Father, Lord of heaven and earth. Okay, every time in Luke's Gospel after 10:21, he doesn't say Father and then say Lord of heaven and earth or heaven or anything. He just says Father, the word Father by itself. He's already established when Jesus is talking to Father who that Father is. So he doesn't need the in heaven. He just says Father. Okay. The next thing in Matthew after that, may your name be honored. This is new. Luke keeps it. Luke has may your name be honored. Okay. Then the next one, may your kingdom come, also new. Luke keeps, may your kingdom come. Then Matthew has, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, this isn't new. Your kingdom coming, meaning you will rule on earth as you do, you will rule on earth as you already do in heaven. He's asking the Father for this. That is the same thing as your will being done on earth as it is in heaven. That's the same thing as the kingdom coming. Luke gets rid of it. The next thing in Matthew, give us today our daily bread. Luke keeps that. It's new. And forgive us our debts. Luke keeps this, but changes debts to sins. Forgive us our sins. Matthew's using debts in a metaphorical sense. As we ourselves have forgiven our debtors. Matthew has that. Luke keeps it. It's new. For we also forgive everyone who is indebted to us. All right. Now, Matthew says, and do not lead us into temptation. That's new. Luke has it. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Now, here we need to be a little bit, examine the theology here. Does God lead people into temptation, or are they tempted by Satan? Well, for theologians, like there's the active will of God and the permissive will of God, or modern theologians. But for ancient theologians, they really don't make that differentiation as much as modern theologians do. Anything God allows, it happened by God's will, because he could have stopped it if he wouldn't. This is the permissive will of God. So God not leading us into temptation and God delivering us from the evil one are the same thing. Luke gets rid of that because God not letting us go into temptation is the same as God delivering us from evil. All right, so this is my explanation for why the Lucan version is shorter. He's gotten rid of repetitions in Matthew and kept just the new elements of the prayer. Are you with me so far, Jacob?
Yes.
Okay. Any comments on that before we move on to talking about Mark?
None so far?
Okay. So where did Matthew's Lord's Prayer come from? Mark doesn't have it, or does he? In Mark 11:25, which we just looked at, Jesus has coming down from the mountain. Peter asks him about the fig tree, and we have that verse from Mark about whenever you stand praying, forgive, that your Father who is in heaven forgives you just as you forgive everyone else. That's the basis of the Lord's Prayer, isn't it? You forgive other people and God will forgive you. So what Goulder saw here is, well, the words your Father in heaven are already in Mark, right? In order for Matthew's version of the Lord's Prayer has changed one letter. He's changed it from second person into first person plural, our Father in heaven instead of your Father in heaven. And then he says, may your name be honored. Well, where did this come from? Because that's not in Mark. Sorry, I need to check my notes here. So Goulder looks at this and he sees, well, it's not in Mark, but it may have come from the Septuagint version of the Ten Commandments from Deuteronomy 5. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, which is given as a negative command, but this is putting it in the positive and saying, may your name be honored. Why did he use it that way? Well, the idea of honoring the name may have come from another of the Ten Commandments. Keep the day of the Sabbath to honor or sanctify or hallow it. Okay, so may your name be honored. Probably Matthew is filling out the content of Mark using something that he took from the Ten Commandments. Okay, may your kingdom come. Well, this is floating around in early Christianity, right? That we have the Aramaic formula, Maranatha, our Lord come, and the more familiar, thy kingdom come. So from Paul's time, we have our Lord come. So this is probably already out there. Matthew adds it here. Now he says, may your will be done. Well, interestingly enough, when Jesus is praying on Gethsemane, this is prior to the time he's arrested and then tried and then crucified. Jesus prays to God in Mark 14:36, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, but not as I will, but as you will. And Matthew, in his version of the passage, has "your will must be done," which are the exact words in the Lord's Prayer. So this is another bit of prayer, right? He's got this "Our Father," that's in a prayer in Mark. Then "your will be done," that's in Jesus' prayer on Gethsemane. And Matthew's put it here, "may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." That's a description of the coming of the kingdom. Now, give us our daily bread. Well, there's another, this is something that is of a concern to Matthew elsewhere, Matthew 7, 9, 11, which is not in Mark. "Is there anyone among you, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, although you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?" So ask for bread and he'll give it to you. Matthew has that elsewhere in his gospel. So this idea, pray for your daily bread and forgive us our debts. Okay, so we're back to Mark here, right? If you forgive those who are indebted to you, in Mark 11:25, your Father will forgive you your debts. Same thing as we ourselves have forgiven our debts, back to Mark 11:25. Matthew has them in the reverse order, but he has this "forgive if you have anything against anyone, and your Father will also forgive you your sins." All right, so this is the issue. In Mark 11, how are sins forgiven in the absence of the temple? Well, whenever you stand praying, just ask your Father, and he will forgive you just as you would forgive those who are indebted to you. And finally, do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Well, in Mark 14:38, when Jesus is praying on Gethsemane, the disciples all fall asleep. Jesus tells them, stay awake while I'm praying. And Mark presents them, they all fall asleep in Matthew 2. So when Mark finds them asleep, he wakes up the disciples, and in Mark 14:30 says, "Pray that you do not go into temptation." So Jesus has already, in Mark's gospel, has made a command to the disciples on how to pray. Pray that you don't go into temptation. And this shows up in the Lord's Prayer. Do not lead us into temptation. They're praying the same thing. And deliver us from the evil one is the second half of a couplet. It means the same thing as that. But Matthew is finishing it here. Where did he get the idea? Well, not really sure, but the only other place the evil one shows up is in Matthew's parable of the wheat and tares, where the evil one, that's the only other place in the New Testament where the word, or at least in the Gospels where the word occurs, right? That we have this evil one showing up. So it's a Matthean concept. All right. So Goulder's argument is without another source, Matthew could pretty much compose the Lord's Prayer based on Mark 12:25. Mark 11:25, as Jesus is coming down from the mountain. The instruction, the prayer of Jesus in 14:36, "Your will must be done," and then commanding the disciples, "Pray that you do not go into temptation." So just the prayers in Mark provide about half the content of the Lord's Prayer, and then Matthew has filled it out and made it more rhythmic using the Septuagint, using a few other things, but Goulder's argument is Mark has actually written the Lord's Prayer, and then Luke has taken it over and omitted some material. All right, so this doesn't come from a Q hypothesis. Matthew composed it himself based on material found in Mark. Okay, done with that. Jacob, you still with me? Okay, any comments?
We have a super chat. I want to take a look at that real quick before we continue. Renzo Rodriguez, thank you for your super chat. Comments on the Didache version of the prayer.
I know the Didache version. I think I think the author of the Didache is later than Matthew and probably later than Luke too. I know Alan Garrow has argued otherwise. I don't think I'm not prepared off the top of my head to answer his criticisms right now. But yeah, I do think the Didache is later than Matthew.
Is there another slide?
Yeah. Okay, the Syrophoenician woman. All right. So this is another case where arguably there is no source for the story of the centurion, right? The centurion's boy, which is in Matthew 8, and the centurion's slave in Luke 7, it's a miracle story, and it's allegedly from Q, because it's not found in Mark, okay? There's the Q hypothesis says, well, there's this centurion story, and it must have come from Q because it's not in Mark, and both Matthew and Luke have it. Goulder argues that the Lucan version is taken from the Matthean version, and one of the things you can see is that in Matthew, the centurion actually comes to Jesus. In the Lucan version, he's kept off stage. He sends a Jewish embassy to Jesus to ask for the miracle rather than coming himself. All right. Goulder argues that the centurion's boy is actually a retelling of Mark's Syrophoenician woman, or in Matthew, it's the Canaanite woman. All right. And if you're used to reading the Gospels as they are historical documents and they were written by eyewitnesses to Jesus, and every miracle story in the Gospels corresponds to something Jesus actually did in his lifetime, which people later wrote down. What Goulder argues is, well, no, the Matthew and Luke and John and probably Mark, but we have a hard time getting behind Mark because he's the earliest, right? They're writing works of literature, theological works of literature. And if we look at the structure of the centurion's boy in Matthew and the structure of the Syrophoenician woman in Mark, they're remarkably similar stories, except that the Syrophoenician woman, who is a Gentile, comes to Jesus to ask for healing for her daughter who's not on the scene, who is somewhere else. In the centurion story, the centurion, who is also a Gentile, comes to Jesus and asks for healing for his boy who is not on the scene but is somewhere else. All right, so in the first, it's a woman asking for a healing for her daughter, and she's a Gentile. In the second, it's a Gentile centurion asking Jesus to heal his boy. Now, a lot of translations translate the word pais, hopais. It's literally male child, and I want to translate it boy, and I think it probably is his son, as it's a daughter in the Syrophoenician woman. The reason it's often translated as servant is it can have that meaning in the way, boy, you might refer, well, you're not supposed to, but you might refer to sort of your boy, right? It's sort of derided, well, at least diminutive way of referring to a servant. I think the reason that most translators go with the translation of servant instead of boy is that Luke has the word doulos, or slave, there, and servant and slave could mean the same thing, but it wouldn't be, a centurion's son and a centurion's slave would not be the same, and they think, but I don't agree with this translation. I think it's he says my boy, and it means my son. All right, so the woman comes to Jesus and she asks him for a healing. All right, my little daughter has an unclean spirit. Will you heal her? And Jesus says, let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. All right, so he seems to be saying, yeah, but you're a Gentile. I can't really do this for you, right? That wouldn't be appropriate. And what happens is she says, but she answered him, sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And she's saying, okay, but I'm not taking anything away from the children of Israel, but you could do this for me. And he says, for saying that, you may go. Now, this is interesting because she argued Jesus out of a point, right? Jesus says, well, let the children be fed first. He seems to be saying, I'm not going to do it. And then she makes this incredible statement of faith. And he says, for saying that you may go. The demon has left your daughter. All right. What happens in the centurion? The centurion does the same thing. He comes in front of Jesus and he says, will you heal my boy? And Jesus here says, I will come and cure him. And most commentators don't understanding this agreement say, yeah, I'll come and cure him. Most of it's like, this is what you expect me to do? You, a Gentile centurion, want me, a Jew, to come and cure him? I will come and cure him. And the centurion says, Lord, I am not worthy to have you under my roof, but only speak the word and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and come, and he comes. Do this, and to my slave, do this, and my slave does it. This is once again an amazing statement of faith that he knows Jesus can do this, and he knows that he's in command of spirits, and he knows he's in command of healing. You don't even have to come to my house. I know you can do this. You just command it, and it will be done. And what does Jesus do when he hears this? As with the woman, he's convinced. When Jesus heard him, he was amazed and said to those who followed him, truly, I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. So this is a pretty impressive statement, like what the centurion has just said. It's not only is it an amazing statement of faith, but Jesus hasn't found that kind of faith in Israel. And this is something you find throughout the Gospels. Israel doesn't come off really well. Only a few people actually believe Jesus and follow him. Okay. In no one in Israel have I found this faith. And he goes on about how Israel has rejected him. I tell you, many will come from east and west and will take their places at the banquet with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness where there will be, and we get this great Matthean expression that occurs once in Luke, weeping and gnashing of teeth, or wailing and gnashing of teeth, right? They'll be thrown into hell. It always is talking about being thrown into hell when Matthew says wailing and gnashing of teeth. So what's he actually saying? Many will come from east and west, and this is the Gentiles, and take their places at the banquet of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Strangers will come and take their place in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom, the Jews who are genetically supposedly descended from Abraham and Isaac, will be thrown into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, not all the Jews, some of them will follow Jesus, but in general, this is fairly anti-Jewish, okay? And then Jesus says, as with the woman, go, let it be done for you according to your faith, right? The woman made an incredible statement of faith, and the centurion made an incredible statement of faith. These are Gentiles, and they're outperforming the Jews. And then what do we have? The person being healed never actually appears on the scene in the story. It happens at a distance. And Jesus, so the Markan story concludes, and when she went home, she found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Okay, she gets home, and it's happened just as Jesus said it would. Jesus didn't actually have to come and heal her. He just commanded it, and it happened, which is the same thing that happens in the centurion story, which concludes, and the servant was healed in that hour. We don't even have the centurion going home to verify this. The narrator, Matthew, just tells us the servant was healed in that hour at a distance without Jesus ever coming to the person being healed. So these stories are awfully similar. A Gentile comes to Jesus, asks for their child to be healed. Jesus initially makes a demurral or a non-committal statement. The Gentile makes an incredible statement of faith about Jesus' ability to do this. Jesus says, well, for this great statement of faith, I will do it, and the healing takes place at a distance. And Goulder's argument is he's got a version of the Syrophoenician woman in his gospel under Canaanite woman, but this second version, it's really the same story being retold. It's not a completely different miracle story. This is a doublet. And every New Testament scholar knows there are doublets in the Gospels. There are 2 feeding miracles, right? And the question is, do they come from sources, or do people just create doublets? And the answer is there's both. There are places where there are doublets that come from the source. Mark already has 2 feeding miracles, and so does Matthew, because he's using Mark. But in this case, Goulder says, look, this is just, Matthew has created a redactional doublet. He's changed just a few details of the story, but the basic structure is there. It's the same. Okay, Jacob, back to you, because I was going to finish up there. Any questions?
So basically, what I've been seeing here is that basically that Matthew. So since Luke used Matthew, Matthew used Mark, and Luke also used Mark.
Right.
We're finding material in Mark that is supposed to be in a way in Q, but it's very similar to what's in
But
Q.
it's, yes, is the non-Markan material that Luke and Matthew share really non-Markan material, right, or is it Markan material that's been changed a little bit? That's the big question, and that's the secret of the Farrer-Goulder hypothesis. Farrer didn't go there. This is Michael Goulder is saying a whole lot of the non-Markan material is reused Markan material. And if you accept that hypothesis, then there's no need for Q. And in fact, it sort of disproves Q. If Matthew created the centurion story from the Syrophoenician woman, then Luke must be dependent on Matthew. And then we have in John, there's the royal official's son, which is another version of the same story. And Goulder would argue, and as Farrer had argued, the Gospels are written in the order Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, with each of the evangelists knowing all of his predecessors. Okay, and they know all of them. And what does this do for what's called the criterion in historical Jesus research? You frequently hear of the criterion of multiple independent attestation. We know something is true if it's found in multiple sources, if those sources are independent. So somebody like Bart Ehrman, who is, not credulous by any means, accepts that, we know the historical Jesus actually did things that were accepted as miracles by people who were there at the time or not much later, because it's attested in multiple independent sources. We find it in Mark, we find it in Q, we find it in John, that Ehrman doesn't think John is dependent on the synoptics. I think he thinks Thomas is independent of the synoptics. So we've got these independent sources all showing this. What happens if the sources are not independent? Well, we don't have a way of doing this, checking this source against this source. We have what's in Mark, and we don't have a lot of ways to check on what Mark wrote.
So how did Matthew and Luke retool the sayings of Jesus from looking at Mark? What did they do?
All of the sayings in general?
Yes.
Okay. The big thing, Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, I can't address all of it at one time, but a lot of the sayings are based on Markan material, and Luke is dependent on Matthew. I can't do all the sayings. Let me talk about some of the parables. Matthew has a parable of a man with 2 sons, and Luke has a parable of a prodigal son. And it's very different in details. Nonetheless, Matthew has a story about a man with an obedient son and a disobedient son, and so does Luke. Matthew has a dishonest steward, and so does Luke, but Luke's is sort of a good guy, and in Matthew, he's a bad guy. In Matthew 22, we have the parable of the Great Supper. And if you look at Matthew 22 and compare it to Matthew 21, the parable of the Great Supper and the parable of the wicked tenants have the same structural similarity that the Syrophoenician woman and the and the centurion have. That in the parable of the wicked tenants, right? God lets out his vineyard and people are disobedient and God is going to cast them out. If you look at Matthew, right, so that's in Mark 12 and then Matthew 21. But if you look at Matthew 22, where it's the parable of the Great Supper, instead of sending multiple people to collect rent from tenants, he sends multiple people, he does multiple sendings of people to invite his subjects to a wedding. And just as in the wicked tenants, they don't pay the rent and they abuse or kill the people being sent to collect rent from them. In Matthew 22, in the parable of the wedding banquet, what happens is, they don't agree they don't show up for this wedding that they're invited to. And they even kill the wedding invitees. And that seems a little bit over the top. I mean, you can see rent collectors, right? You wouldn't react to them well, but killing wedding invitees. But the thing is, it looks just like the Markan parable of the tenants, except there's this mini parable at the end where somebody shows up without a wedding garment and he gets cast into the outer darkness where there's wailing and gnashing of teeth. And if you look at Matthew 22:7 is sort of a giveaway that he's talking about. This was a judgment on the Jews. In 22:7, right, the king, after his servants have been abused or killed, he decides he's going to, he's going to send an army to destroy the city of those people who wouldn't come to his wedding. All right. 22:7 seems to be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. In 22:7, most people agree on that. Jonathan Bernier is an exception. But then the second parable, somebody shows up, and this is verses 11, 14, 22, following right on. Somebody shows up and doesn't have a wedding banquet, and he doesn't have a wedding garment that's proper to attend the banquet, and he gets thrown into the outer darkness where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. And that's beyond the abilities of most kings to do. So the king in this parable is clearly God. Your average king cannot throw people into the outer darkness. What is Matthew trying to communicate there? Well, verse 22:7 is probably talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. And what Matthew is telling his audience in the additional verses 11-14, with the person who shows up at the wedding banquet, is, okay, so 22:7, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, that was a particular judgment of God on Jerusalem. There's still going to be a final judgment, which everyone, including you, will face. The judgment that happened in 70 is not the last judgment. That's still to come.
We got another super chat. Renzo Rodriguez again. Thank you for your super chat. If the Gospels were written after Josephus' Antiquities, what was Christianity like from the 30s to the 90s?
I would say Luke is definitely after the Antiquities, or Luke is very probably after the Antiquities. Matthew around the same time, Mark around the same time or slightly earlier. But by and large, I accept that premise of the question. I think to look at what Christianity was like from the 30s, at least to the year 70, I accept the 7 Pauline epistles, right? That the 7 generally accepted Pauline epistles, accepted as being authentic and written before 70 by Paul. I accept those. So we can look at 1 Corinthians and see, how does the church work? We can look at Romans, we can look at Galatians, where Paul's actually angry at the people. But there's a real complexity to the question, because this only tells us how Paul's predominantly Gentile converts outside of Judea, what Christianity looked like to them. What did it look like inside Judea is another question, and a really difficult one. Okay, and I think we should look at what Gabriel Bookchini calls eschatological Judaism. People like the Essenes and the Zealots and so forth. Was Christianity within Judea more like them, and I lean more toward the Essenes than the Zealots, But was it more like that they formed these sort of brotherhoods within Judaism, that it was a sort of sectarian Judaism that didn't admit all Jews into it, that you had to be a member of the specific sect to be a member of the people of God and saved? I think that's probably what Palestinian Christianity looks like. But the thing we have sources for is, non-Palestinian Christianity in the diaspora, or Gentile Christianity.
That gives me a question. What do you think about the Dutch radicals' argument about Paul's letters? Or yeah,
Right, they have the four Hauptbriefe. There are only four of the epistles are authentic, and I think that was Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. I read 1 Thessalonians as being authentic, and Philippians, and Philemon. It's too short to really do a lot of analysis on, but I don't see any reason that it shouldn't be authentic. One of the arguments, I haven't spent a lot of time on the Dutch radicals. One of the arguments they use was that every epistle has, one idea and should be explained in terms of that. And I think that's a mistaken approach, because I think Paul is theologizing on the fly. So he's addressing a whole bunch of things. There's some unity to it, but Gentile Christianity is basically an idea Paul has in his head. When Jews convert to Christianity, there isn't really a whole lot of conversion. They continue to do the things that they were doing before, only they've accepted that Jesus is the Messiah, and the end times are almost here. When Paul is writing to his Gentile converts, he's told them, stop worshiping the pagan gods. And what are they supposed to do? You don't have to follow the Jewish law. And then particularly, 1 Corinthians, you'll see this, right? He's told these people, you don't have to follow stop worshiping the gods of the Gentiles and worship the God of Israel. But you don't need to follow the Jewish law. Well, it creates a situation of antinomianism. Like, what rules are they supposed to follow? And this is why Paul has to write these letters, particularly 1 Corinthians. You can see this. They're writing him, so what are the rules? How do we do this? And Paul is saying, well, okay, in this situation I do this, in this situation I do that, in this situation I do this. He's sort of making up Gentile Christianities as he's going along.
Would you connect that to? Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt if I did.
No, I was done.
Would you connect that to what Paul says in Galatians? I am all things to all men. He tells one person this and one person that, or
right,
make everybody happy.
I think what he's all things to all men is, I can't remember where. Galatians, Corinthians, and Romans, he's dealing with that issue in all of them. He's the most hostile in Galatians. Romans, he's more even-tempered. But what he's saying is, when I'm among the Jews, I act like a Jew. I follow the kosher laws. I do all that, because the important thing is that these people accept Christ as the Savior, because that's what will get them saved. So when he's with the Gentiles, he doesn't follow the kosher laws. He eats, he'll eat the Gentiles' food. He hangs out with Gentiles. He eats at their houses. All of that is fine. When he's with the Jews, he acts like a Jew and follows the rules, because that will make him more credible to them, and he can get them to accept that Jesus is the Messiah. And that's the important thing.
Is there anything in Matthew and Luke that you would consider to be truly non-Markan?
There is in John. I'd have to. Okay. So in Luke, there's stuff that's Markan and stuff that's Matthean. I'm trying to think. I don't think there's anything in Matthew. Well, I guess you could say the infancy narrative is non-Markan. It's not really in conflict with Mark, but it's additional material. Matthew has written sort of an entire, birth to death and resurrection thing. Mark, I accept the theory Mark ends at 16:8 and doesn't have post-resurrection appearances, right? So Matthew has written this entire story, whereas Mark only has part of it. For all we can tell from Mark, Jesus was a regular guy until he's baptized by John the Baptist and receives the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily true. I'm saying for all we can tell from reading Mark, that might be true. But Matthew wants to make clear, no, Jesus didn't suddenly become the Son of God at his baptism. He was, even before he was born and conceived, this was God's plan, and then he was conceived from Mary, right? So Jesus was the Son of God all along. It's not something that happened at the baptism. So that's a difference.
Why do you think Matthew modified Mark so extensively? What was the point of that, in your opinion?
Okay. My theory about Mark is he's writing for a very specific situation, which is one of intense persecution. Right? He's worried about Christians apostatizing during a time of persecution. You see this in Mark 9:1. He who acknowledges me, I will acknowledge in front of my Father. And then in Mark 13, the eschatological discourse, a lot of it is about, time of trouble and persecution. Don't worry about what you will say. You will get called up in front. So Mark is worried that Christians are going to be persecuted officially and brought up on trials. And when they're asked, are you a Christian? They're going to say, nope, not me. Nope, never heard of this guy. And besides, I don't like him. We see this in Mark's gospel with the intercalation of Peter and Jesus. While Jesus is on trial and he's asked if he is the Christ, he doesn't deny it. Meanwhile, Peter is in the courtyard outside and he's asked, are you a follower of this man? And he says, nope, not me, never heard of him. Right. So I think Mark is presenting this as Jesus is a good model for how to behave in time of persecution. Don't apostatize. And Peter is actually a bad model because he apostatizes. So I think that's what Mark is about. Now, Mark is writing in a time of intense persecution, and he wants to get Christians through that. And he thinks the end times will be coming soon. There isn't a lot of teaching material. Like, how do you run a Christian society? What do Christian ethics look like? Mark isn't really concerned with that. If you read Matthew, there's a lot of stuff about how do you run a church, right? He who has a grudge against your brother, remove the speck from your own eye, that kind of thing. Follow what the Pharisees do, but don't follow them in their heart. Follow the Pharisees in what they rule about the Bible. They're good interpreters of the Bible, but don't follow them in their hypocrisy. They don't really do it. Okay, so Matthew is much more concerned than Mark is with establishing a set of morals or ethics by which a Christian church could operate.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me again, Ken Olson. This has been a really fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, it's definitely interesting because it gets a lot of people to think really hard, and it really shows that the synoptic problem is quite complicated. Perhaps depending on how one looks at it. It's very intriguing stuff.
Yeah, and the way you solve this, a lot of people tend to just look at the Gospels. They're all saying the same thing, and they're all simultaneously, equally true or equally untrue for some people. And the synoptic problem or relationship of John and the synoptic doesn't really matter. And I think if you're interested in the history of early Christianity, the synoptic problem and the question of John's dependence or independence of the synoptic Gospels are really important.
Yep, I agree. I'll see all of you later. Thanks again, Ken.
Glad to be here.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.